G'day folks, it's Luke Rowe and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in the science of learning, and this is part 2 of our 2-part series on an introduction to the topic of intelligence or general cognitive ability. And if you didn't see the last part, go check that out. It's presenting this idea of intelligence in what I hope to be an innovative way, where I've put a whole lot of documents, a whole lot of peer-reviewed articles, 48 to be precise, and 2 YouTube clips, extended interviews with intelligence experts, into Google Notebook LM. And Google Notebook LM uses the Gemini large language models, the AI software, to auto-generate a podcast. The podcast is then spoken in interactive form between 2 AI-based hosts, and those interlocutors navigate these expert topics, or these topics based on the expertise that they extract from the sources of information that you give them. So those 48 articles are all peer-reviewed articles. They're all articles that I trust, that I've used in various publications and scientific projects that I've done in the past. And so I'm going to come in as the expert fly on the wall and intervene where I see them misleading their audience. I'm going to critique the accuracy of their statements and just try and bring a bit more context and expert context to bear upon what they say. But, so far so good. They're doing pretty well. I think that the first half, if you haven't seen that already, check it out. I think it's worth commenting on some of the things that they say that are somewhat misleading, but by and large, it's incredible software, and we should be grateful that Google is going to give us an incredible generation of auto-generated podcasts that are as good, if not better, than most podcasts out there in the marketplace of ideas. So watch out, podcasters. Google's going to come and eat your lunch. So let's get into it. Starting where we left off last time. So here we go.
Short-term memory, visual processing, the list goes on.
Wow, it's like a whole cognitive orchestra. But does CHC theory mesh with that network model we were talking about?
It does. Actually, CHC theory provides a framework that supports that network model. It says that these different cognitive abilities are interconnected and influence each other rather than being organized in a strict hierarchy.
Okay, so it's less about how smart you are in general and more about understanding your unique blend of cognitive strengths and weaknesses.
You got it. And this shift in thinking has big implications for how we understand and assess intelligence.
It's like saying, let's stop trying to fit everyone into the same box and celebrate the unique ways our brains work.
Exactly.
Look, I think that's a sanitized version of how things really are. I just don't agree with them. And I don't think that Kevin McGrew's article that I fed it on the Tellhorn-Carroll theory actually says that. I think that it's more about the idea of a general cognitive ability known as the G factor that is, by and large, explaining the lion's share of variation in the more narrow domains of intelligence that sit below that. So there is a hierarchy there, and that's certainly the case with the Tellhorn-Carroll model. It is a hierarchical 3-stratum model of intelligence. So I just don't think that the Google Gemini software has extracted that information in a faithful way. I don't think it's a faithful representation of what the CHC theory of intelligence actually says. So just watch out for that. I think it's more of a more palatable, sanitized version of intelligence. And I think it's easier to say that we're all unique, we're all different, and that is true. But we are also all the same in some sense. We're all fundamentally human, and we all have very similar processes that allow us to conduct scientific investigations and make generalizations about human nature on the basis of those similarities. So just bear that in mind when it comes to mental abilities, that we are more similar than we are different. The variation is actually a very small subcomponent of human nature. How much overlap we have, how similar we are, is the lion's share of what the human experience offers us. It's the variation that does make us different and special, but it's the similarities that make us human. So I think that could be lost on people in this conversation. So let's get back to it.
But what about this idea that we can train our brains to become more intelligent? Is that just hype, or is there some truth to it?
Right. All those brain training apps and games, do those things actually work?
Well, Neubauer, the neural efficiency guy, suggests that training and practice can actually lead to more efficient brain activity patterns.
Yep. So like, I might not become a math genius by playing Sudoku, but I could potentially improve my memory or attention span.
Exactly. And it seems that your existing level of intelligence might influence how much you benefit from training.
Wait, so smarter people might get even smarter through training. That seems kind of unfair.
It might seem that way, but it's still just a hypothesis. And even if you're not starting with a super high IQ, targeted training can still be really helpful for boosting specific skills and improving overall cognitive function.
So it's like,
Okay, so it's important to note that the vast majority of research suggests that the ability to transfer a knowledge and skills happens to the extent that the transfer context matches the training context. Right? So if you conduct your learning experience in a particular domain of knowledge and you get better at that, whether it's working memory games or whether you do brain training exercises, you tend to get better at those same working memory games and the same brain training exercises, and not at other tasks that are more general or adjacent to or even further away in different domains of knowledge and skills. So that means that if you go and do a brain training exercise that allows you to do crossword puzzles, for example, you'll get better at crossword puzzles. And that may help with some underlying general activity in your brain. And that's a recommended daily practice for those who want to keep their minds, their mental acuity somewhat sharp. Same with exercise and daily nutrition, and sleep. These are all important factors to contribute to the efficiency and health of your brain, and the way in which your brain processes information will be contingent upon those things. Not necessarily because you trained your brain like you do at a gym and got big mental muscles by doing brain gym. It doesn't work. There's plenty of studies that show that brain gym doesn't transfer. The only thing it makes you better at is brain gym. Right? It won't make you smarter for your studies, and the literature is very well established in that space. The research is very clear. We call it near and far transfer. Near transfer is when you train in a certain area and you perform in a certain area, and to the extent that they are similar, you tend to improve at them through that training process. To the extent that they are different, you don't get the transfer of skills from the training environment to the performance environment, or to the different contexts of performance. So just be aware of that.
Even if you weren't born with a silver spoon, you can still invest in your brain and see some returns. I like that.
Me too. It's about recognizing that intelligence isn't fixed and that we have the power to shape our own cognitive abilities.
It's like your brain is a muscle, use it or lose it. But let's zoom out for a second and talk about those mental models we use to understand the world. How do our brains create those?
It's a pretty deep topic. Think about how you wrap your head around something complex, like economics or physics. There are so many factors involved, right? But our brains somehow manage to create simplified representations, mental models that help us make sense of it all.
It's like our brains are constantly creating shortcuts to navigate the overwhelming complexity of the world.
Exactly. And a couple researchers, Johnston and Fusey, have been studying this. They suggest that the development of these abstract representations is influenced by something called the dimensionality of latent variables.
Okay, whoa. Dimensionality of latent variables. That sounds like a mouthful.
I know, right? Think of it this way. Imagine you're trying to figure out the stock market. There are tons of things that can affect stock prices, right? Company performance, economic trends, global events. Those are like the latent variables, hidden factors that shape what we observe.
And the dimensionality part refers to how many of those factors are really important.
Exactly. If we can figure out the key drivers, the most important factors, we can create more accurate and efficient mental models.
So it's like finding the signal in all the noise.
That's a great way to put it. And Johnston and Fusey's research suggests that our brains are constantly doing this, searching for those key variables that explain the patterns we see in the world.
That's pretty amazing. But what about how all this changes as we age? Do our brains...
Okay, before we get on to aging, it's worth validating what they've said. And I think what they're flirting with is this idea of the Bayesian brain and predictive modeling. And active inference. If you want to look at Carl Friston's work, I highly recommend it. He speaks volumes on this. You can see some YouTube interviews with him, as well as his landmark papers in Nature and Science. He's a prolific author, neuroscientist, very well respected. And it's basically saying that we all contain mental models that we are constantly updating based on. So we have the past information. That's the default setting of the model, the prior. And that prior knowledge interacts with the current sensory information that we are getting through our sensory modalities, and that information might help modify or update those prior models. So if there's differences, those models will start to adapt. It's like updating a map based on new territory that you're discovering. And then that helps us better navigate the future. So you get the past, prior models, the present interacting with the past models in an updating process to make active inferences about the future. That's how we navigate the complexities of life, and intelligence helps us do that, so to do it more efficiently. So check out the Bayesian brain hypothesis as well as active inference if you want to learn more about that.
Brains process information differently as we get older?
Good question. Neubeck and some other researchers looked into this. They were studying how different cognitive functions, like intelligence, memory, attention, are interconnected in the brain, and they found some interesting age-related differences.
So, like the strength of those connections, the way those different abilities interact can change over time.
It seems that way. For example, in older adults, the connection between intelligence and working memory was actually stronger, and intelligence seemed to play a more central role in the overall network.
So as we get older, our brains might compensate for some decline in certain areas by leaning more heavily on other strengths. Like if my memory isn't as sharp, my brain might tap into other resources to keep things running smoothly.
That's a possible explanation. It seems the brain is constantly adapting, reorganizing its networks to maintain function as we age.
That's encouraging to hear. It means that aging doesn't have to be a downward spiral. But their research also highlighted the importance of one cognitive ability in particular, working memory. What's so special about that?
Well, working memory, that's basically your ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it, is crucial for a whole bunch of things, from problem solving to decision making to understanding language. And Neubeck's team found that it seems to be particularly important for maintaining intelligence as we age.
So if we want to keep our minds sharp, working on our working memory could be a good strategy. We're talking brain training games again?
Brain training games can be helpful, but there are other ways to challenge your working memory too. Things like learning a new language, playing a musical instrument, even having stimulating conversations can all help.
It's like a mental workout for your brain. They're seeing a theme here. Intelligence isn't just something you're born with. It's something you can cultivate and nurture throughout life.
Absolutely. And that brings us...
Okay, so there's heaps to unpack there, and I think that they're touching on what is really an important topic. And it's going to be hard for them, obviously, to compress the really important points into such a short discussion, a brief discussion about the impact of age and the developmental trajectory and maturation on intelligence. But a few key points. The first is that we know that working memory, which is a big component of intelligence, is very closely related to what we call the fluid dimension of intelligence, fluid intelligence. And this is our raw reasoning power, our ability to really navigate complexities in real time and rapidly shift between and transition between complex ideas and patterns. Right, so that's our raw reasoning capacity, and we've got this contrasted with our crystallized intelligence. That is the sum of our educational attainment, the things we've learned over time, right? So fluid intelligence, that is the processing power, the raw reasoning power that helps us learn and accumulate that kind of more static knowledge that becomes an accumulation of your reasoning power. And those two come together whenever we're interacting with any information and trying to navigate the complexities of life, right? So we know that peaks at around 25 years old. So the mitochondrial efficiency is a big aspect of that. And so many things peak physiologically at about 25 to 30, depending if you're male or female. And then they go downhill in terms of the speed thereafter. And so one of the things that happens, though, is your intelligence doesn't necessarily drop, even though your working memory efficiency starts to drop. Right? And so your speed of information processing is also very closely related to working memory. And that also starts to drop after about 25. what happens is you've got the compensatory mechanisms of having a broader and deeper, there's more breadth and depth to your storehouse of knowledge. The repository of knowledge is more rich, and that allows you to be more efficient at problem solving, at navigating space, right? So even though you've got the peak physiological function at about 20 to 25 years old, perhaps even a little bit earlier, depending on gender, you've got all these other accumulative benefits to your thinking power and your thinking and mental capacities as you age, up until a point, up until about the late 50s, early 60s. And then you have potentially some cognitive decline thereafter, significant cognitive decline after 65 to 70, perhaps post 80, you are certainly not going to be in your prime. All right, but what we know is that crystallized intelligence, that kind of storehouse of knowledge and how that interacts with your intelligence, is quite stable over a lifetime, even when our fluid intelligence starts and our working memory systems start to diminish. So one of the things that we also know is that a great protection against things like Alzheimer's, dementia, and protective factors against cognitive decline are what we call cognitive redundancy. And this is when you build your cognitive capacities when you're young, so that if they start to diminish when you're older, they've got still, even if you have 10% of your cognitive abilities diminish, if the 10% of your cognitive abilities leaves you with 90% of your prior abilities, and your prior abilities were very rich and you'd had a high level of intelligence to begin, then you've got some margin for error there. But if somebody's got lower cognitive abilities and that declines 10%, there's no margin of error. So there's no cognitive redundancy built into that cognitive decline process in their elderly years. So one of the best things you can do to stave off that really dysfunctional dip and that cognitive decline that's going to end up being really threatening to your function, your day-to-day memory systems, cognitive systems, and cognitive ability, is to build your intelligence over a lifetime. Best way we know how to do it is to live the healthy life with the good sleep, good eating, being socially interactive with others, and of course, educational enrichment. All right, and some exercise. So they're going to help build your cognitive capacities and stave off the cognitive decline as long as possible. And even if you have some cognitive decline, you've got cognitive redundancy built into the picture so that you can handle some of those declines more effectively than others. Let's get back into it.
Us to another fascinating and maybe slightly unsettling area of research: the potential for enhancing intelligence through genetic interventions.
Okay, now we're getting into some serious science fiction territory. Are we talking designer babies with super intelligence?
Not quite. It's still early days, but Plomin and von Stum, in their work on the new genetics of intelligence, suggest that advances in our understanding of genes could lead to new possibilities for boosting cognitive function.
So instead of directly manipulating genes, we might be able to target pathways and processes that influence how those genes are expressed. It's like fine-tuning the software instead of rewriting the hardware.
That's a great analogy. Imagine identifying genes that are involved in synaptic plasticity, that's the brain's ability to form new connections. Targeting those genes could lead to interventions that improve learning and memory.
That's incredible. But it also raises a whole bunch of ethical questions, right?
Before we get onto that, just improving synaptic plasticity is not going to be a silver bullet for improving intelligence. We've got to be very careful there because the brain is in a very delicate balance between flexibility and stability. And there are trade-offs when you lean too far one side or the other. All right. So we know that if your brain is too stable, you can't update those prior beliefs and mental models easily. So you're somewhat immune to new knowledge. All right, so you're unteachable to that extent that your brain cannot be flexible and update. Then there's the other side of the equation, where if your brain is too flexible, nothing's gonna stick. You've got a sieve for a mind, and so as a result, there's no stable cognitive architecture that you're cumulatively building, and knowledge requires that. It requires some level of stable cognitive architecture, and it's built in layers and nodes, and not necessarily, in an entire metropolis equivalent at a time, or an entire network of neurons at a time. So we've got to be careful there when we start to allude to the possibility that genetic engineering through stimulating plasticity or short-term or long-term synaptic plasticity or plastic changes is going to automatically improve our intelligence. It's not a given. There's a book here that I highly recommend. Right on the top. It's by Scott Small. He's a neurologist, great writer. It's a good little book. Highly recommend. It's called Forgetting, and it's about the importance of forgetting. Right? We need the flexibility in our brains to be able to forget. It's metabolically more efficient because it allows our brains to bring new information in and push the unimportant information out. Right? There's a very healthy process there, and so having some flexibility, but not too much, is a really good thing for your mind. So let's keep going.
Who gets access to these enhancements, and what are the unintended consequences?
You're right to be cautious. As we gain more power to influence intelligence, we also need to think carefully about the ethical implications.
It's like we're standing on the threshold of a new era, and we need to be really thoughtful about how we proceed. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about something that's often overlooked when we talk about intelligence emotions. Emotions. I thought intelligence was all about logic and reason.
That's a common misconception. While intelligence definitely involves things like problem solving and decision making, emotions also play a huge role in shaping our thoughts and actions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do emotions actually influence intelligence?
Well, research has shown that our emotional state can have a real impact on how well our brains work. For example, when we're feeling anxious or stressed, our working memory can take a hit.
That makes sense. I know I don't make my best decisions when I'm feeling super stressed out.
Exactly. On the other hand, positive emotions like joy and curiosity can actually boost our cognitive flexibility and make us more creative.
So it's not about suppressing emotions. It's about learning to cultivate the right emotional state to support good thinking.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us to the concept of emotional intelligence, or EQ. It's all about understanding.
So before we go into EQ, I think it's worth validating what they've said and just pointing out the literature is very clear that people who have gone through stresses, chronic stress, for example, adverse childhood experiences and trauma will have detrimental impacts particularly to their working memory, because we know that long-term exposure to the body's stress hormones which is cortisol, is going to influence the it's chronic HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activation. It's getting your body prepared for battle every single day, even though there's no beast to slay or no war to participate in. Your body is priming for that. So all these resources are being put to the body in a very anxiety-provoking, arousing fashion, and there's a cost to that. One of the costs to the brain is the atrophy of the hippocampus. Right, so these are the working memory networks in our brain, and the hippocampi are really important for consolidating short-term to long-term memories. And as a result of the trauma and the cortisol circulation detrimentally impacting that through the HPA axis chronic HPA axis activation, you can see literally on an MRI scan people who have gone through traumatic stresses, such as police officers or army war veterans. Even children who have gone through terrible, unspeakable things will have atrophied hippocampi. So it's a very sad situation, and it's unfortunately very difficult to reverse that damage. It can be done over a long arc of time, and particularly for younger people. But certainly this is why we see a lot of the issues with people who have gone through traumatic events having disrupted educational, their journey in education is very severely disrupted, and their learning capacity is reduced. So that's a good point. Emotions and the activation of our emotional systems and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and how that interacts with our physiology has huge implications for the way we think, our cognition, our intelligence, our working memory, and for our learning and education.
and managing our own emotions as well as the emotions of other people.
EQ, yeah, I've heard that term thrown around. But how does EQ relate to like traditional IQ? Are they totally separate things or do they work together somehow?
Some researchers believe that EQ is just as important as IQ, if not more important, for success in life.
Really? So being able to navigate social situations, build relationships, empathize with others, that's just as valuable as being a brainiac.
It seems so. And it makes sense, right? In a lot of areas of life, being able to connect with people, understand their emotions is crucial.
I can definitely see that. Okay, so emotions are a big deal. But now we're getting into...
Yeah, so maybe that's an overstatement. I think the most rigorous investigations that I've seen around the relationship between emotional intelligence and general mental ability, what they are referring to as book smarts, there's a bit of a false dichotomy because there is overlap. Those two constructs are intellectually separate, conceptually distinct, but empirically we can't separate them. And in other words, there's a strong correlation there. And if you look at the work of Lisa Barrett Feldman, Lisa Feldman Barrett. This is a really interesting book, and she's got an interesting hypothesis, which made her quite well known as a neuroscientist, as a cognitive neuroscientist, that suggests that emotions are just essentially a positive-negative valence to our thinking. And she calls it the theory of constructed emotions. And that whole idea is that we have this separate category we call emotions, but it's just really our thinking when we've got, particularly polarized valence, positive or negative valence to any type of thinking that we have. And so that whole idea of the separate aspect of our cognitive thinking, our thoughts, and our emotional intelligence, some people would challenge that. And again, the claim that emotional intelligence is more important than IQ, I've never seen really convincing research to suggest that that is the case, other than when you hold all things equal. Is emotional intelligence helpful? Yeah, it is. It can add some degree of advantage to a person who's got emotional intelligence above and beyond general intelligence. And again, it's hard to disentangle those two things empirically. So naturally, if you improve one, you're going to improve the other as well. They're not in separate worlds. We don't have people who are, wonderful. It's been debunked in the literature that people who are really good intellectually, really successful intellectually, are bad with their people skills, that are terrible with their people skills. We know the two skills are correlated. So book smarts and people smarts are actually positively correlated things. So we've got to be careful of these false dichotomies and picking up too much on the popular views on things. I'm a little bit cynical of some of the claims that were made there. So just be aware that there is a lot of debate in the literature about all of this.
This is really deep territory, the nature of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Is that something we could even study scientifically, or is it more of a philosophical question?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and it's tricky because even defining consciousness is hard. It's like that subjective experience of the world, our awareness of ourselves and what's around us.
So it's what makes us feel like we're here experiencing life.
Exactly. And the relationship between consciousness and intelligence is still a mystery. Some people think consciousness is necessary for intelligence. Others think it might just be a side effect of complex brain activity.
So we might be able to create AI that can solve problems and learn, but they might not be conscious in the same way humans are. They might be smart, but not truly aware.
That's one possibility. And as we delve deeper into this, we'll explore some of the different theories out there. But let's shift gears again and talk about another aspect of intelligence that's often associated with, genius creativity.
Creativity. Intelligence.
That's a common misconception. Creativity, whether it's expressed through art, science, different theories out there.
Sorry, I screwed that up a bit.
And talk about another aspect of intelligence that's often...
Before we do that, let's just quickly recap that really enormous point that they made around the idea of consciousness and how that might be a emergent property or a property that can be replicated through computer algorithms. Is the self-awareness a prerequisite for consciousness? I'm not sure. It's not my domain of expertise. I'm very interested in it. My own layman's view on consciousness is that it's a byproduct of how the brain feels itself. That is, it is the brain's sense of awareness of itself. And there is a whole lot of research being done by Anil Seth and I highly recommend his book. Brilliant. Mark Solms. These guys are some of the best books I've ever read on consciousness. Highly recommend them. Love their work. In fact, I would say that Being You was probably my favorite book that I read last year. 2023. And then the year before that, I think it was the year before that. Year before that, I'm reading The Hidden Spring, Mark Solms' work, probably my favorite book the year before that. Really beautiful books, quite complex, not the sort of quick read before bed, but I highly recommend them. And again, I don't claim expertise in this area, and I'm not sure where we'll go with this, whether we'll have conscious, artificially intelligent and conscious computers and software in the future. I think in principle it's possible.
Associated with, well, genius creativity.
Creativity. I always thought of that as more of an artistic talent, not really related to intelligence.
That's a common misconception. Creativity, whether it's expressed through art, science, or everyday problem solving, is a cognitive process. It's about generating new ideas, new solutions, new perspectives.
So it's not just about being good at drawing or writing. It's about thinking outside the box.
Exactly. And while there's definitely a connection between creativity and intelligence, it's not as straightforward as you might think.
So you can have someone who scores sky high on IQ tests, but can't come up with an original thought to save their life. And conversely, someone who might not be a genius in the traditional sense, but who's brimming with creative ideas.
That's what research suggests. Creativity seems to be this complex mix of different cognitive abilities, personality traits, even your environment.
So maybe intelligence provides the raw ingredients, but creativity is the spark that ignites them.
I like that. And speaking of sparks, remember that concept of cognitive reserve we touched on earlier?
Yeah, it's like our brain's ability to withstand.
Okay, before we get on to that, this is very interesting because I've done a little bit of research on intelligence and the overlap with creativity. And certainly for my doctoral studies, I used tests on some of the most widely used and validated tests on creativity. And these were things like the remote associates test, the divergent uses tests, alternative uses test it's called, as well as I administered thousands, hundreds, perhaps even thousands of IQ tests, validated IQ tests to various participants, and I've done that throughout my career. So the way in which creativity and intelligence are often juxtaposed as separate capabilities is an overstatement. And again, it's kind of like what we were talking about before with the emotional intelligence being falsely dichotomized from cognitive intelligence or book smarts and people smarts. These are false dichotomies. These things are overlapping because they come from the same person, the same mind. So there's naturally going to be overlap there. I think it's still helpful to have a conceptual distinction between the two, but we can't, falsely inflate the differences there. I think that would be misrepresentative of the empirical data that we're seeing where there's overlap. And there certainly is between intelligence and creativity. And it also depends on what we mean by creativity. If we're looking at creative thinking, certainly we know our tests of creative thinking are very strongly correlated with tests of intelligence. If we're looking at creative outputs and creative lives, well, that's a bit of a different story. It becomes more complex there. These are creative outcomes, as Kaufman would say, the capital C, big C creativity. These are the people who are producing Nobel laureate-worthy inventions. These are the great Picassos and the Rembrandts and the Monets of the art world. These are people, your Elon Musks, who are creating new technologies, engineers. So when we talk about creativity as a product, I think then we've got some potential separation and different determinants of that creative products and the creative, so-called creative genius. I think there's a lot of other aspects that contribute to that life and those sorts of outcomes compared to the creative thinking processes that might be antecedents to that, but not deterministic of those creative outcomes. So just be aware of that in the literature. There's certainly a demarcation there.
Stand damage and keep functioning well, even as we get older, right?
Exactly. It's like having a backup generator for your brain. And building up cognitive reserve seems to be crucial for healthy aging.
So it's like building a mental savings account that we can draw on later in life. How do we do that? It's all about brain training games and crossword puzzles.
Those can be helpful, but it's really about living a mentally active and engaged life. Education, learning new things, staying socially connected, challenging your brain with new experiences. All of that contributes to building cognitive reserve.
So the more you use it, the stronger, more resilient your brain becomes.
That's the idea. And there's even research looking at interventions that might help people who are already experiencing some cognitive decline.
Wait, really? So even if there's already been some damage, it's not necessarily game over?
Not necessarily. Things like brain training, certain types of therapy, even non-invasive brain stimulation techniques are being investigated.
So there might be ways to actually stimulate the brain and slow down or even reverse some of the effects of aging. That's incredible.
It's still
We talked about this before, so I won't go into it now, but just be aware that the brain training games and apps are a bit of a gimmick for the most part. There's a little bit of promise there, and I think Stanislas Dehaene and some of the people in his lab, as well as Neubauer and some of the others who work on cognitive decline, cognitive redundancy effects, and staving off that, there is some promise there. I don't think we're there yet, but it's a bit of a hype cycle, and I think an overstatement to say that these are showing that they're more effective than sleep, that they're more effective than having a low-sugar diet, that they're more effective than exercise and remaining socially active and intellectually curious. These are all factors that are going to be major contributors to staving off your cognitive decline, as opposed to spending 20 minutes a day on your iPad playing Duolingo or something like that. I think Duolingo, probably a bad example. That might be actually quite helpful. Crosswords, Duolingo may be quite helpful, but I think the idea is to stay mentally active. More generally, it doesn't need to be a brain training app per se.
still early days, but there's some promising research out there, and it all points to the amazing plasticity of the brain, its ability to change and adapt, even later in life.
That gives me so much hope. It's like we don't have to just passively accept cognitive decline. We can be proactive about protecting our brain health.
Exactly. But before we wrap up, there's one more topic I wanted to touch on, and I know it's a sensitive one: the potential for intelligence to be influenced by things like race and gender.
Yeah, this is an area where we need to tread carefully.
Yeah.
But it's an important
Okay, I'm getting nervous. Let's see what they say.
conversation to have, right?
Absolutely. And remember what Richard Hare said in that podcast interview: separating scientific inquiry from political and social agendas is crucial.
Right, because even acknowledging that there might be...
That's the podcast that he did with Lex Friedman. I recommend you go and check it out. I think it's like 2.5, 3 hours. Very interesting. Richard Hare is a fascinating guy. So is Lex Friedman.
Group differences in intelligence, regardless of the cause, has become incredibly controversial.
There's a fear that any discussion of these differences will be misused to justify discrimination or reinforce existing inequalities.
But ignoring potential differences doesn't help either. If there are real disparities, we need to understand them so we can address them effectively.
I agree. Sweeping a problem under the rug doesn't make it go away.
So what does the research actually say? Are there any statistically significant differences in intelligence scores between different racial or gender groups?
There have been studies that have reported such differences, but the interpretation of those findings is super complex and contested. Some researchers argue that these differences are mainly due to environmental factors, things like socioeconomic disparities, access to quality education, even cultural biases in the tests themselves.
So it's not about inherent differences in cognitive ability, but about systemic factors that create unequal opportunities.
That's one perspective. Other researchers suggest that genetic factors might also play a role, but that view is highly controversial and the evidence isn't clear-cut.
It sounds like this is an area where we need more research that's done carefully, ethically, and with a real understanding of the complex interplay between genetics, environment, and culture.
I couldn't agree more.
Nor could I. I agree with them, and it was well said. Well done, Google. I was afraid that Google would sanitize the controversial ideas, but they tackled it, and they tackled it carefully and sensitively. And I think that's a fair appraisal of the state of literature on both racial and gender differences in IQ. I think they're going to get onto the sex differences soon, which I'll be able to shed some light on. I know far less about racial differences. Now, it's not my area of expertise, but I think that it's fair to say that there is more variation within races than there are between races in terms of intelligence, right? So we're more similar than we are different. And just from an evolutionary perspective, you shouldn't be thinking of evolution as bifurcating across branches on a tree. It's more like a trellis. And we know that so racial differences biologically are very, very difficult to identify and to define. And so we have common ancestry, and that to me is enough to say that those differences are, in my view, when we have such strong common ancestry and overlap in our genome sequences and how our ancestry and heritable traits date back, I think it's enough to give my mind the bias or the tilt towards favoring the environment is explaining those differences. And again, I mentioned this in the first part. When you take a test, you build a test, any test in a certain socio-cultural ecological niche, and you have people who are from that niche doing the test, they're going to do better on the test because it was built and imagined and conceived in their ecological niche. The moment you have people from another ecological niche using that same test, there's going to be a mismatch between where the test was developed and the ecological niche that group of people or that racial group or that ethnic group have come from. So there might be a mismatch where there's the test is not picking up on the variation in that person's cognitive abilities as readily, and therefore it might be a blunt instrument in detecting what are highly adaptive traits, what we would refer to as intelligence, right? So again, I do have concerns about how the literature all too quickly has causal attribution around racial differences being explained by genetics. Certainly, we've got to be very cautious about it. And there's been no randomized control trials on this. Of course, it's unethical. So we have to be super careful. And as long as we have environmental differences, it's very, very difficult. Certainly socioeconomic differences and lived experience differences between people groups. As long as we have those, we can't rule those out as the primary, if not the sole, contributors to those differences and disparities in racial groups on IQ tests. And again, it's another leap to say that, okay, if there's differences between racial groups on IQ tests, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are differences in intelligence per se, because those two things are different. The intelligence of the person, of the people, of the racial group is different, is not the same thing as their IQ. And again, if the IQ test, for example, if you don't speak Japanese and I administer an IQ test to you in Japanese, you're not going to do very well at it. It's not built for you, for your language, for your culture. All right, so this is where I'm talking about the mismatches happening there. So we've got to be very careful about the conclusions we have from that topic.
And as we continue to learn more about intelligence, we need to be prepared to have open and honest conversations about these sensitive topics, always grounded in evidence and guided by a commitment to equity and inclusion.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We've gone from defining intelligence to exploring its relationship with education, success, even creativity. We've peeked into the brain, considered the role of genes and environment.
Okay, we've got to be careful here about going down the whole DEI pathway. It's great to talk about equity and inclusion, but we don't have equal intelligence. It's that simple. It's not equitable. That is how nature rolled the dice, and it's not equitable in the raw ingredients we've got, and it's not equitable in how we cook them up, right? So everyone's going to get a different, the genotypes and the phenotypes and how intelligence manifests will be different for everyone. So to make everyone equal at intelligence, I don't think that is a noble goal. The point that I think that is important to make here is that intelligence isn't deterministic of life success. We shouldn't say that in order to have a successful life or to be equal with one another, that we have to make our intelligence equal. It will never be equal. Unless we have some kind of genetic engineering revolution, there's a homogenizing effect. Or as I mentioned in part one, where the disparities in intelligence, because remember, intelligence is normally distributed, those disparities between people at either end of the distribution or across that distribution are nullified or compensated for with artificial intelligence. But you can always argue that anyone with high intelligence plus AI is going to have some kind of interaction effect and an accumulative cognitive ability that is superior to the person with low intelligence plus AI, right? So there's not an equal playing field there. I don't know if it's right to say that we want one, because then it places too much premium on the notion of intelligence in the first place as being synonymous with a person's worth. So I feel very uncomfortable with that kind of inference there, and I think that's implicit in what they're saying. So I feel like we've got to be careful in using these $20 terms of equality and equity and inclusion. Yes, we have to be careful and inclusive of people, and being very careful not to use and abuse science to marginalize groups that are already vulnerable, that have already been oppressed and suppressed in society. But at the same time, we've got to be careful to not over-sanitize everything we do with these slogans, or to sloganeer things to the point where they're inverse to the intended outcome. Right, where we start to actually cause more inequalities because of our naivety around trying to create equalities. So let's get back to it.
And even ponder the potential impact of artificial intelligence.
It's been amazing, and I think we've uncovered some key takeaways.
Definitely. First and foremost, intelligence is not just a single fixed thing. It's this dynamic and multifaceted ability shaped by both nature and nurture. And while it's a good predictor of a lot of things in life, it's not the only factor.
We also learned that our brains are incredibly adaptable, and we have more control over our cognitive health than we might think.
Right. Lifelong learning, staying mentally active, engaging in new experiences, all of that can help us build cognitive reserve.
And exercise and sleep and education. They're the biggest factors.
And keep our minds sharp as we age.
And maybe most importantly, our understanding of intelligence is constantly changing. New research is coming out all the time, challenging old assumptions and expanding our knowledge of what it means to be intelligent.
It's an exciting time to be exploring this topic, but before we wrap up completely, I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
Oh, I love a good brain teaser. What is it?
If you could enhance just one aspect of your own cognitive abilities, what would it be and why? What kind of impact might that have on your life and on the world around you?
That's a great question. It makes us think about the potential of intelligence, not just for individual gain, but for making a positive difference in the world.
I like that. So, listeners, take some time to reflect on that question. What aspect of your intelligence would you boost, and what would you do with that enhanced ability?
And in the meantime, keep exploring. There's a whole world of fascinating research out there just waiting to be discovered.
All right, so
that's a fascinating question. I think that my obvious answer would be to say the general intelligence factor, because that is explaining the lion's share of the variation in all of those sub-capacities of intelligence. And I do buy into the hierarchical aspect of intelligence, at least at this point. I think that I might be convinced towards more of a network model. I think that's quite compelling. And as artificial intelligence starts to mount evidence in favor of network models, and I think that's kind of where it's going, perhaps we'll move away from that hierarchical aspect, that hierarchical putative model of intelligence, towards more of a networked model. But at least for now, that's what I would choose. Perhaps if I couldn't choose the general intelligence factor, I'd be saying that my reasoning around fluid reasoning and working memory would probably be something that I'd want to improve, because that's the most sensitive to age-related decline. And if I could stave off the decline of that, I think it would be of great benefit to me and to the things that I try and do every day in my work and in my learning journey.
So we've got These incredible brains capable of logic, emotion, even this potential for consciousness. It's mind-blowing. But can science really explain something as mysterious as creativity? Is it just pure magic?
It's a question that's captivated thinkers forever, right? But while we might not have all the answers, research is giving us some clues about the cognitive processes behind creativity.
So it's more than just artistic talent. It's about how our brains generate new ideas. Think outside the box.
Exactly. And while a high IQ can certainly help, it's not a guarantee of creative genius. There's actually a lot more to it.
So you could have someone who aces every standardized test, but struggles to come up with an original idea. And on the flip side, someone who doesn't test well could be brimming with creativity.
That's what the research suggests. Creativity seems to be this mix of cognitive abilities, personality, and even the environment you're in. It's like intelligence might give you the building blocks, but creativity is what lets you assemble them in new and interesting ways.
Okay, so intelligence sets the stage, but creativity steals the show.
I like that. But there's another concept we talked about earlier that's really relevant here, cognitive reserve.
Ah, right. Our brain's ability to bounce back, keep functioning well.
That reserve is cognitive reserve.
Ah, right. Our brain's ability to bounce back, keep functioning well, even as we age.
Exactly. It's like having a buffer against cognitive decline.
Feels like we're going in circles here, and we're talking about cognitive reserve for the third time now, and we're talking about creativity and intelligence. They're offering a slightly different inflection on that and perspective on that, but not too much new. I wonder if this is AI reaching its limits, and it's just splitting hairs around these topics, and you get your best information at about the 30-minute mark. Thereafter, you've got diminishing returns. Let's see where we go with this.
And building up that reserve is super important for healthy aging.
So it's like a mental savings account.
Yeah.
The more we put in early on, the more we have to draw on later.
Exactly. And the best way to build it, a mentally active and engaged life. Education, challenging yourself with new things, staying socially connected, all those things matter.
It's almost like the more you use your brain, the more resilient it becomes.
That's the idea. And what's
Yeah, to an extent. I think we've got to also have good rest and let our brains be inactive for long periods of time each day, get into that deep sleep. So that's, I think, missing from this point of emphasis, as well as exercise. It's not just an active brain, but exercise more generally for your body and just being healthy more generally. The indirect benefits are probably larger than doing brain exercises, and the evidence for that's quite clear.
What's really exciting is that researchers are even looking into interventions that might help people who are already experiencing some cognitive decline.
Really? So even if there's been some damage, there might be ways to help.
Potentially. Things like brain training, specific types of therapy, even non-invasive brain stimulation are all being explored.
So we're not just accepting decline, we're fighting back. That's amazing.
The research is ongoing, but it points to the incredible plasticity of the brain, its ability to adapt and change, even later in life.
Okay, so we can actively protect our brain health.
Okay, so the idea of plasticity is really sexy and we love it because it gives us hope that it's never too late to change, but there's a massive curve on neuroplasticity in terms of how plastic our brains are at the beginning of our lives versus how plastic they are at the end of our lives or towards the end of our lives. Massive diminishing returns. So we have, if you were to plot that on an XY axis, you'd see this huge rise in learning new things, and then it staves off. And so we can still be lifelong learners. I'm not trying to be pessimistic about this. You can always learn up until the day that you die, but your capacity to learn new things and the sensitive periods around language, our language centers, the working memory decline, the fluid intelligence, and your capacity to have raw reasoning power, it all declines as you get older, and you've got normal natural cell death, apoptosis, you've got axonal and neuronal pruning, and that kind of aspect of your brain is going to have a diminishing return on investment for the amount of time that you put into a learning task versus what you get out as you get older. It's reality. We just got to face it. It doesn't mean we can't learn. It just means we're not as efficient or as effective at it as we get older.
But before we wrap things up completely, there's one more topic I wanted to touch on, and I know it's a sensitive one.
Oh, yeah.
The whole question of whether intelligence can be influenced by things like race and gender. It's something that's been debated forever, and I know there are a lot of strong opinions on both sides.
It's definitely a
Wow, we're going around the hamster wheel. We're looping back. Let's see where it goes. I wonder if it'll talk about sex differences, which it didn't before.
complex and sensitive issue. And as researchers, it's crucial to approach any discussion of group differences in intelligence with extreme
Blah, blah,
caution
blah, blah, blah.
and sensitivity.
Heard all that.
And as Richard Hare pointed out, separating the science from
Even probably controversial.
there's this fear that any discussion of these differences will be used to justify discrimination.
Right? Like to reinforce existing inequality.
This fear that
It doesn't make it go away. So what is the research differences in intelligence scores between different racial or gender groups?
environmental factors like socioeconomic disparities, that genetics might play a role, but that view is highly debated, and the evidence
Saying the same things, same as before.
I agree. And as our understanding of intelligence continues to evolve, we need to be prepared to have those difficult conversations, always grounded in evidence.
We talked about the influence of genes and environment, and even considered the rise of artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we're wrapping up now, and I think that last sort of 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, really did recycle the topics we spoke about earlier. So, Google, you got some work to do. Notebook LM is still a fantastic program, and I'm going to continue to play around with it, upload some of my interactions with it. Hopefully, it's valuable for your own learning journey. And if you've got a topic in mind, I will be happy to explore that. So please do notify me in whatever way you can, and I'll see if I can deep dive into a topic and give you my opinion on it. So I think we'll wrap it up there with the final overview that they're going to give in the next 40 odd seconds, and we'll see how they go.
And hopefully we've shown that intelligence is a lot more complex and nuanced than we might think.
Absolutely. It's not just a single score. It's this amazing tapestry of abilities shaped by our genes, our experiences, and the choices we make.
And the most important takeaway, maybe, is that our understanding of intelligence is constantly evolving. New research is coming out all the time, challenging old assumptions and opening up new possibilities.
It's a really exciting time to be exploring this field. So listeners, keep those brains buzzing. Keep learning, questioning, and marveling at the incredible power of the human mind.
And remember, the quest for understanding is a lifelong pursuit. Never stop exploring.
Wow, okay. So now that we finish on that optimistic note, I think it's worth carrying that momentum forward and saying, yeah, we've now learned about intelligence. At least we've got a basic introduction to the notion of intelligence. I hope you found that insightful. I kind of found it fun to critique the innovative approaches to podcasting with the Google Notebook LM podcast function. I recommend you do it yourself. Have a go at it. Put your own journal articles or personal written work into it and see if you can create a podcast about your own written work. And then you can critique it, see if it's gone in the correct direction or whether it's strayed from the material that you fed it, and to what extent that it imposes its own values and ideology upon your work. That's a fascinating thing as well. So yeah, it's an interesting space to be in. I hope you enjoyed this session, something a little bit different. Let me know if you want to listen to more of these types of podcasts / videos, and I'll see you in the future. Thanks for listening.